What would you do for a chocolate cream donut? Hi everyone, I'm Jacob, I'm the Cowhat Librarian, and I'm here tonight to talk to you about The Doughnut Fix by Jessie Janowitz. Tris is an average boy. He has a mom and a dad, he has an older sister and a younger sister, and he lives in the greatest city in the world, New York. But that's about to change. His dad worked at a bank where someone had committed fraud and he could no longer work in financial services. His mom was ready for a change of scenery, and so before he and his sisters know it, his parents have bought a house in the tiny town of Petersville, upstate. There's not much there. The house is a purple monstrosity that Tris quickly nicknames the Purple Monster, plus the roof leaks, which is unpleasant when you have the attic bedroom. And his parents have plans for them to become members of this new community. His mom is a chef who's fairly talented, and she plans to open a restaurant there. There are no other restaurants in town, and she thinks it's a great opportunity, as does her husband, Tris's dad. So the family packs up, they leave behind their friends, they leave behind family, they leave behind their schools, and they move to Petersville. And to make things worse, Tris and his sisters don't even get to make friends right away, because even though they're moving in November, their parents and the principal of the Petersville school decide that to ease the transition, Tris and his sisters won't have to attend school until January. So they're facing 2 months with nothing to do, nothing to look forward to. Tris's parents say that they'll all be working on some kind of individual project to keep their minds active, but this is of no interest to him. So the first morning Tris wakes up, and as I mentioned, the roof leaked and he woke up wet, and he decided to bike down into town to see what he could find for breakfast. And he ended up at the general store where they have a sign, handwritten, that says, "Yes, we have chocolate cream-filled donuts." And no, this sounds pretty good to Tris. In fact, this sounds like the only worthwhile thing in Petersville. So he heads in and speaks with Winnie, the owner of the general store, and asks about the donuts. And he finds out that they were absolutely amazing, and people could not get enough of them, and that she no longer makes them. It was too much work. According to Winnie, they had been so delicious and so popular, she couldn't make enough, and she just became tired of making them. And she left the sign in the window because she liked to remind people that she previously did make them. So Tris buys some eggs, so at least they can have some breakfast at home, and gives up and heads for home. Well, a few days later, he decides to try a different tack. You see, Tris has learned from his mom, and he's quite a good baker, and so he asks Winnie for the recipe. If she won't make them, he will. Well, Winnie asks why she should give the recipe to him, and he says, well, I could sell them so you don't have to, and I could give you a cut of the proceeds, and I'll call them whatever you want. Winnie thinks this sounds pretty good, but there's a catch. Tris has to prove that he's a good baker. So he makes a test project, some lava cakes, and brings them to Winnie, and she says they're quite good. And he asks for the recipe again. And there's a catch. He has to have a business plan. With no other recourse, Tris trudges over to the town library and meets a boy there his age named Josh, whose mom is the librarian, and Josh helps him research how to write a business plan through one of the dummies books that's at the library. And together they work on the business plan, and Tris works on a way to knock Winnie's socks off so he can have the right to make these donuts. In the meantime, he learns about everything from how to negotiate with suppliers, to pricing details, to how to figure out the labor involved in making all these donuts. It's great. Tris is a very well-realized character with clear motivations for what he's doing. He's talented in baking, but there are enough rough edges that this is definitely not a wish fulfillment character. Tris is not wonderful. He's annoyed with his parents for making this decision. He's frustrated with Winnie for the things she's doing. He's not particularly tactful at all times when he's dealing with the new suppliers he's going to have to cultivate. He's a great character. His family dynamic is great as well. There are all these little things that make them feel like a very real family. His dad knowing just enough French that when he gets angry, he starts speaking in it. And his sister commenting, well, Dad, don't start Frenching at us. And his little sister being really, really into eating the things he makes, and his older sister being very academically inclined and very smart. And they're such a nice family. And I found myself rooting for their whole family in the different things they wanted to accomplish. And I definitely found myself rooting for Tris and for when he would finally get the donut recipe. It was wonderful, and I recommend it. And if you have any bakers in your life, any would-be chefs in your life, either as your children or students in your classroom, if you have people who like books like the Cupcake Diary series, perhaps, if they were willing to try something outside of that series, this would be a nice follow-up. And as an added bonus, there is a sequel book called The Doughnut King that I'll be talking about in a future video. It's great. Go borrow it from your local library. Now, with that said, there are spoilers ahead because I have to talk about the deal breaker. Okay. As I said before, Tris and his family and the principal agree that they won't go to school for 2 months to make the integration process smoother. I call nonsense. That is absolutely ridiculous that his parents would agree to it. It is just baffling that they would think keeping him out of school is the best thing when he could be at school and making new friends and developing a connection to this community instead of rotting in their house and trying to do a project that he doesn't want to do. I know it made the time available for him to pursue the donut project, but it felt very, very forced. And the principal of the school, I cannot imagine a principal that would turn down students and say, well, wait a couple months before you come, especially when so much school funding is based on enrollment. I am sure that that 2 months of enrollment and having Tris and his sisters there that extra semester would translate into extra funding for that school. And for a small community like Petersville, that principal would be grabbing at every dime. It's pretty unrealistic in my opinion. The other thing that struck me slightly the wrong way was just that the stakes for this book seemed so low for me. The bad stuff for Tris happens. It happens right from the get-go. He leaves behind his city and family and friends, and he's stuck in Petersville. And I understand that in that context, he's looking for anything to grab onto, and that these chocolate cream-filled donuts are the object he gloms onto. But what's the worst case scenario here? He doesn't get to make some donuts? The stakes felt really, really wishy-washy to me, and that they weren't big enough. I wanted to cheer for Tris. I wanted him to get them, but ultimately, if he didn't get the recipe from Winnie, who cares? That was a little disappointing. But how the book wrapped up really, really made things worth it, because Tris does get Winnie's respect, and he does start his business, and he does get the recipe from her, and the donuts are good. But because Tris is a baker, because he's learned so many tricks from his mom, there's a wonderful sequence where he's making the recipe his own, where he's adapting the dough by adding plain mashed potatoes to it to make it lighter and fluffier, where he's adapting the chocolate cream by adding a little bit of instant coffee to cut the sweetness slightly. It is a wonderful scene that really, really shows how talented Tris is and how dedicated he is and how much of a craftsman he could be. And it made me very, very much believe that this boy could run his own business. It was delightful. And yes, I'm aware I used that word far too many times in the previous video, and I'll limit it to once here. The small town nonsense, and if you've lived in a small town, you'll know what I'm talking about, is bang on. The fact that there's another store owner that doesn't want Tris to compete in any way, shape, or form with him, and having a conflict of interest because he's the one who will grant Tris his business license, and the community turnout when Tris finally completes a batch of the donuts and has them available. It was great. I highly, highly recommend it. I recommend the sequel, and I'll talk about it in a future video. With that, thanks for joining me. Please like and subscribe, and please check back to see what else I'm going to talk about from the Cowhat Library. Thank you. Bye now.